Hello. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to Barnardo's annual reception at Labour Conference. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. My name is Adam Pemberton. I'm the Director of Strategy. I'm delighted to welcome Shadow Secretary of State John Ashworth, who will be speaking this evening. I'm also thrilled to see councillors from across the country, party members and sector colleagues, and a huge thank you to Google for being our sponsor this year. I'm really pleased that we're able to work together with Google to raise awareness of the challenges facing vulnerable children and to talk about how we can keep young people safe online. For those of you who don't know us, Barnardos is the oldest and largest national children's charity in the UK. We are 153 years old, and last year we worked with nearly 300,000 children, young people, parents and carers to build stronger families, safer childhoods and build positive futures for our children and young people. Every year we like to use Party Conference to shine a light on the big issues facing vulnerable children and young people in the UK. Even at the best of times, these issues rarely get a hearing, often for the simple reason that children don't have a vote. But this year, more than ever, we've seen British politics and debate starved of oxygen to discuss absolutely anything other than the B word, and in this context, the B word is sadly not Barnardos. And that has to change, because there's a danger that the events of the next few months could result in a really perilous situation for vulnerable children and families. This is what keeps me and my colleagues awake at night. Imagine a perfect storm of a no-deal Brexit, the economic shock that follows afterwards, and families turning to the state for help, but the services they need just not being there. And so what people then do is what they've done for many years, which is they turn to charities. But in a time of economic shock or uncertainty, donors will be giving less to charities. So where will the vulnerable turn then? I mean, that's the worst case scenario, but it could happen. And so while we've already got huge challenges facing children and young people, it's really time that government and as a society we get back to addressing them. Our event today marks 30 years since the Children Act 1989, which is still the foundation of all child protection law, policy and practice. The Act has been changed 20 times and expanded since then to introduce new duties and support for vulnerable children and young people. But despite all that, children today are facing challenges just as complex and difficult as the challenges they faced 30 years ago. 1 in 8 5 to 19-year-olds has a mental health condition. More than 4 million live in poverty. More children are going into care every day, and too many are being excluded from school. Knife crime has peaked, and child criminal exploitation is spreading across the UK with so-called county lines drugs trafficking. All of that fits into what Barnardos calls a poverty of hope, affecting a growing number of children and young people. We understand the challenges of material poverty, but this is even more complex. This is children growing up with poor housing, no qualifications, no job prospects, no role models, and little hope or belief in a positive future. And there's another 30 years ago, you had to knock on your friend's door if you wanted to go out and play. We watched films on VHS. Personally, I had a Betamax, but we listened to music on cassette. We went to the library to get a book. It's an immense far cry from the digital childhood of today. And we know how things are changing even quicker. Our survey found that 28% of adults and 39% of young people think 30 years from now will be using holograms to communicate or in-body technology. I actually think it might come much sooner than that. So those are fantastic opportunities, but there are new risks. We all know about cyberbullying, online grooming, and the constant exposure to images of perfection that do real damage to young people's mental health and well-being. And this is fundamentally changing the meaning of vulnerability. In a digital context, even children in supportive, comfortable family homes are walking around with the equivalent of a camera crew in their pocket. And they take that camera crew to bed with them every night. So the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what do we do about all of this? New funding has been announced, but it's just for 1 year, and it won't be remotely enough to reverse recent cuts, but it's a start. I think it's really important that no matter what lies ahead, there should be cross-party agreement that we need to protect investment in the services that matter most for our children. We heard today about protecting and increasing spend on adult social care. We need to be thinking about the same for children's social care. What we've learned since 1989 is that the danger to children comes in all shapes and sizes. It's inside the home, it's in the community, it's on and offline. Parents obviously have a role to play in this, but so does the state. But ultimately, this is about the whole community: schools, local authorities, police, charities like Barnardos, communities themselves, and companies, whether that's your local takeaway, your local taxi firm, or tech giants. Everyone has the power and the responsibility to contribute to our children's safety and well-being. We need to think beyond traditional roles and powers and budgets to embrace a new approach that we call community parenting. And since we're here at Labour Conference and colleagues are hoping to be in government one day, here's a suggestion. We've been thinking about how the next government can lead by example and show that protecting vulnerable young people and promoting their interests through community parenting is everyone's business. And the first thing we think the government should do is to commit to a department not just for education, but for children, so we can get these issues back on the agenda and keep them at the heart of every government where they belong. Before I end and hand over to John, I'm just going to show you a short film which features some of Barnardo's young people and some stats from our new report, which you have seen and which you grab a copy of, which is all about digital childhood.
Hi, I'm Adam and I'm 13 years old. One thing about growing up with the internet I like is that it makes communication easy from people around the world.
Hi, my name is Liz and I'm 21 years old. What I think is great about the internet is it enables you to find so much information and also find people who share similar experiences to you.
What's good about the internet for me is being able to talk to my family who's on the other side of the world.
I'm Tilly, I'm 14, and I think the best thing about the internet is probably keeping in touch with friends and family, and the worst thing about it is probably like comparing yourself to everyone that you see online.
My name is JJ and I'm 15 years old. The best thing about growing up with the internet is being in contact with your friends. The worst thing about growing up with the internet is having a social media cover and how social media isn't always true to your life. In 30 years' time, I think social media will be more dominant in society. And one thing the government could do is educate parents a lot more on social media.
So I'm delighted, with no further ado, to introduce Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, John Ashworth.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening to say a few words. Gosh, it's been a long day. I started early this morning doing some media. I had an opportunity to speak to the party conference earlier today, but I'm really thrilled to be here this evening to show my support to Barnardos for the tremendous work that you've done for so many vulnerable children over so many years, and you really should be immensely proud of what you have done as an organisation. Everybody who's involved with Barnardo should be immensely proud. Perhaps it's unusual for someone with a health brief to be speaking at an event such as this. Usually you would get somebody perhaps with the education brief or the sort of social services brief and or those sorts of policy portfolios. But I was really keen to come along today because for me, children's health and well-being is absolutely central to all we want to achieve as a potential government. And improving children's health and well-being is absolutely central to my vision of public health and indeed wider health in society. And one of the things I was trying to get across today in my contribution to the party conference earlier was that I think we are failing children in so many ways. We all know about our childhood obesity problems, a third of children leaving school obese. We all know about the immense pressures upon our mental health services for children and about how many children are turned away from specialist mental health support because the system that we have in place simply can't cope. And I think it really is time that we put children central to our public policy development, which is why I've talked about having an ambition as a country for having the healthiest children in the world. Yes, of course, it's a big rhetorical ambition, I accept that. but I think we should absolutely be ambitious for our children. And I think one of the ways in which we would want to do that in government is by introducing something called a Future Generations Wellbeing Act. They've already done this in Wales. The New Zealand government is looking at something similar, and it's about putting in place a legislative and statutory framework that every decision a department makes, not just the Department of Health or the Department of Education or indeed the Department of Children, if that's what we want to reorientate it towards, like it was under the last Labour government, Brown, the conditions for future generations. And that means putting children central to absolutely everything. So that is a big priority for us and a big priority for me as somebody who aspires to be the Health Secretary. But I think there's something even more fundamental we need to do as well. We know that poverty, that deprivation, that inequality acts as a breeding ground for some of the social problems we have in society, and we know the detrimental effect it has on a child's development and well-being. We know, for example, that children living in the poorer households are more likely to leave school obese, are more likely to need the help of child and adolescent mental health services, are more likely to be admitted to hospital, actually to A&E, and more likely to suffer tooth decay, affecting their speech and language development as they are growing up. And we also know children born into real poverty more likely to be born in circumstances which means their health outcomes potentially tragic as well, and our infant mortality rates, that's children dying before they reach their first birthday, are getting worse and worse. In fact, they've risen 4 years in a row, and I think the last time that happened was in the Second World War. We know we've got this increasing burden and prevalence of mental health problems, and I think it's right that we understand the interaction between growing mental health issues and social media, and the social media big tech companies do have responsibilities. And for that, I appreciate they are making progress, but I think there is more that they could do. I mean, I haven't looked today, but a few weeks ago I could easily search some of the hashtags that I don't want to reveal them but you know, some of the hashtags which you wouldn't want your children looking at. I could easily find images on Instagram and so on. That was just the other week when I checked. But also, if I may say so, it's important that we understand the impact of social media on the mental health of our children, but also I don't think we should use it as an excuse or an explanation for all the issues our children are facing, to be frank. I mean, look, this is a Labour Party conference, but this isn't a sort of partisan event. But I do think the sort of the pressures that we put our children under in our school system at the moment, and the way in which sort of Michael Gove or many of the education secretaries took us back to this sort of almost Victorian way, I think he's putting too much pressure on our children. And I was listening to a lecture on the internet the other day from an educationalist. Some of you may have seen the lecture that I'm referring to, and he told an anecdote. So it's not my anecdote, although I'm going to steal it for the reception. And he told an anecdote, this educationalist, about creativity and how we're not nurturing creativity anymore in our children. And he told this anecdote about how there was a little girl, a 6-year-old little girl, in the school, and their teachers found it difficult to engage that little girl in the usual sort of, you know, maths and grammar and all the rest of it. But as soon as the teacher gave that little girl some paper and some crayons, the little girl was absolutely, you know, absorbed in what she was doing. And the teacher said to this 6-year-old little girl, "What are you doing? What are you drawing?" And the little girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." To which the teacher said, "Well, nobody knows what God looks like." To which she said, "Well, they will in a minute." And I think the point is, children are creative. Children are creative. And we need to be nurturing this side of children as well in our education system, not putting so much pressure upon them to just achieve sort of, grades in mathematics and science. Important as all that is, of course, but I do think we've got it the wrong way round with some of the directives that have come out from government lately. So look, we're going to put children first. We're going to introduce a Wellbeing Act to enshrine in law some of our commitments to children and improving their health and well-being. I'm going to insist on trauma-informed policies across the board, because I think the evidence around adverse childhood experiences is extremely strong. And for those of you who don't know, this is essentially the theory, which is backed up by evidence, that children who experience trauma in childhood, whether that's a death in the family, or drink or drug abuse from parents, or domestic or sexual abuse, children who experience those traumas then go on to develop mental health problems, go on to develop physical health problems, go on to develop a whole variety of issues later in life. I mean, some of you may know I've actually spoken about my own personal circumstances as a child growing up with an alcoholic father. So that was my traumatic experience. I became a politician. You can make your own judgment about how damaged I am as a result of that. But I think it's really important that we have this trauma-informed approach to public policy. And I just want to sort of finish on a thing which I was looking at the other week. If you put children's well-being central to all your public policy initiatives, I think we really can change things tremendously. Children are something like 23% of our population, but 100% of our future. And there's an economist called Catherine Trebeck, who I was reading some of her work recently. And she said, rather than the sort of focus on everything being about improving GDP and economic output all the time, important though that is, why don't we measure every year the number of girls who are cycling to school? Because what better yardstick could there be if you've got more and more girls cycling to school than the fact that you'll have more women in education or more girls in education? What better yardstick could there be of children doing something which is good for their health? What better yardstick could there be of children doing something which is good for the environment? What better yardstick could there actually be of a functioning economy? Because if children have got bicycles, it means their parents have managed to, or their carer has got them a bicycle, which means in turn someone has manufactured the bicycle, which means in turn somebody is employed in manufacturing bicycles. So what better yardstick could there be for human progress if every year we measured how many more girls are cycling to school? And I just thought that was a beautiful way, in a very simple example, of trying to capture what we want to do. We want to improve the conditions of society, so we're putting children first, and that all our policies are built upon the emphasis of what is in the interest of children now and in the future. So that is my priority as someone who aspires to be the Health and Social Care Secretary, putting children's health and well-being first. So have a great conference, and thank you very much this evening.
That's great. Thank you, John. Thank you very much for coming. I know you're double, if not triple booked this evening, but thank you for making the time to join us, and we look forward to working with you. Really great to hear that focus on well-being and on trauma-informed practice as well. Barnardos has kind of committed to becoming an entirely kind of trauma-informed organisation in everything that we do. It's a long journey, but it's exactly the right thing so that we do that in all aspects of what we do. But thank you very much for coming. Finally, I'd like to welcome Katie O'Donovan. It says here that her title is Public Policy Manager for Google UK, but I gather that's not right anymore. It's what's going to come up on the screen. Head of Public Policy for Google, who are our generous sponsors for this evening. So, Katie, over to you.
Thank you so much for coming. It's really fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to support a charity as worthy as Barnardos, and it's great to hear our Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. I too had an early start this morning, although unlike Jonathan, I wasn't having to prep for a speech. I was on the five-a-side football pitches of South East London. I had to, rush home and do a quick change to set off here, and I was thinking on my way here, it's a kind of strange thing to do on a Sunday, to leave your friends and family, to come down to the seaside, beautiful seaside as it is, and find yourself in a conference room with lots of people on a Sunday evening talking about politics. And I was thinking about, why are we doing this? Why do we do this? And I think actually I settled on something that was positive, that made me realise it was a good thing I was on the train to Brighton, because all of us, from whatever walk of life we are, whatever background we are, I think realise that politicians, governments, charities and companies, I would argue, need to get together and actually work really hard to help improve everybody's lives, and particularly those of vulnerable children. So it's great to be here doing that. I think Jonathan gave us the challenge, and you've given us the challenge of how Google, which enables people to get all of those fantastic things out of the internet, also need to step up and make sure that we're living through the responsibilities that we have. So we have changed a lot over the last couple of years. That's making sure that our policies keep the internet safe, but also investing in the right programs to help young people across the country. So 4 years ago, we set up a program called Be Internet Legends, which has travelled across the UK, actually reached half of all primary schools in the UK so far, teaching online safety to children. With YouTube, we have a program to help teenagers at the most kind of anxious and sometimes messy times in their life become really good internet citizens. And we've invested in technology like Family Link, YouTube Kids and Safe Search to help us all get the most out of the internet. And I think we've heard so much today about what the future might look like, whether it will be scary or fun or engaging or possibly all of those things. But I wanted to leave you with a bit of research that we did recently that showed that people who use Google Translate, one of our most popular tools, whether they do it on their desktop computer, whether they do it on their laptop, whether they use their voice on their mobile phone, 3 of the top phrases that we most frequently get asked to translate are, how are you, thank you, and I love you. So amongst all of the challenges that we know we will work with many of you in the room to face, we know there's a lot to be optimistic about too. So enjoy the food and drink, and thank you so much, Barnardos, for having us here today.
So, how are you? Thank you for coming, and I love you. No, that's it for the speakers. Before leaving you to continue with food, drinks, and networking, I'd like to thank you all again for coming. Thank our fantastic speakers, John and Katie, and particularly Google for making this event possible. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.